We can actually just start for a couple minutes of just, bring our attention to, bring the attention to the body. Nose breathing, and the other physical sensations, the present moment. Breathe, right? You may be aware of the movement of the breath and in and out of the nose or the mouth. The movement of the ribs as the lungs fill and empty. The movement of the abdomen. Breathe. So as you're aware of the breath, we're just going to be aware of the body, the breathing, moment, little few more minutes, couple more minutes. And be aware, here we're using our wisdom, right, to understand, to see from our own experience how everything about the body is impermanent, changing instant by instant. But the nature of this body is that one aspect of the nature of the body is momentary impermanent. The very nature of my body and of all physical things I interact with is momentary, is impermanence, moment to moment. And if I observe my body, that becomes only, clearer and clearer. Even by sitting up, it's like, usually I don't notice it, but if I really pay attention, it's subtle action of muscle. So I hear sound. Sound is impermanent. The act of hearing is momentary. Well, sometimes I grasp at things as though they last for more than a moment. That grasping at things as if they last for a moment is mistaken. as I like, explore my own body with wisdom, understanding how things actually are. Right? So the breathing is a continuous process. The heart beating, blood flowing. No, right, electric impulses in the nerves, neurotransmitters being released, hormones. Mm. There's nothing static. This is the nature of my body. This body, impermanent, moment by moment. Feel, right? There's the sensation of the breathing, impermanent, changing instant by instant. Just briefly, just for a moment, so you can actually explore a question. Is there an I, a self, in those impermanent processes? Of the lungs filling and emptying a cell, of the ventricles of the heart pumping a cell, of the muscles in the back and legs adjusting. That is a cell. Mhm. Or is there some self that controls all those processes? Which change instant by instant? So just connect to our motivation for today's class, right? Which is, actually, Buddha said, right, that uh, wrongly grasping at a self where there's no self, so wrongly understanding the nature of the self is the cause of suffering. Hmm. Actually, the main reason to study the four foundations of mindfulness, 37 harmonies of enlightenment, the Abhisamaya Alamkara, you can think, right? It's actually to understand, is the Buddha correct? To understand in my own experience, is the Buddha correct that there is suffering, that wrong grasping at a self is the cause of suffering, that it's possible to become liberated from such suffering. Those are the Buddha's core assertions, right? That there's a path. Those are the Four Noble Truths. So I just think like my motivation, my reason for studying this topic, Four Foundations of Mindfulness, is actually that, is to understand from my own experience, is the Buddha correct? In my does Buddha's explanation fit my own experience in relation to suffering? Why do I care? To see if I can help myself and others to be free from suffering, to be liberated from suffering. To see if ignorance causes suffering, if grasping causes suffering or not. And if it does, how do I liberate myself? And then how do I help others become liberated? Mm. And with that, kind of, one time I'll just say the verse of refuge and bleach. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, through the merits of generosity and the other perfections. May I become Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. We just jumped in. We've been studying, right, the four foundations of mindfulness. So we jumped in. That was a practice of mindfulness of body, right? And one thing I was starting to say last time, and it's true, is that actually there are many ways to be mindful of the body. Like sometimes, especially when you're studying the four foundations of mindfulness, it's like humongous. Actually, in each of these four, right, the body, the feelings, um, mind, and phenomena. There are many ways to be practices that you can do to practice mindfulness of each. As we just did one, we're going to do more. So today we're going to explore some of the more about those. And last time, I'd said, part of the definition of the four foundations of mindfulness is it's being mindful of either of the it said the general and specific characteristics, right, of those four objects, and of those four. So last time we talked about the general characteristics, such as their impermanence, is one of those general characteristics. All four are impermanent. Um, so today we're going to start to explore the specific characteristics of those. And there are different presentations in the text. Like, so the Buddha taught different options of how to think about or be aware of or practice being mindful of the specific characteristics of each. So we'll go through a few, so there's not just one way to that point. So we'll go through a few examples. And then among each of those examples, there are sub-examples or something you could say, but which is great. So you have, to me, it's not like giving you more to do, it's giving you options. Does that make sense? So like when you say, oh, there are all these options of how to be mindful of body or feelings, it doesn't mean like it's like, it's not like you have to do all of them today. It's just giving you options so over time you can explore your own experience. So the Buddha is like giving, I would call them almost like, you know, exploratory exercises that you can use to explore your own experience. And that's what all of this is also, isn't it? Mindfulness of these four is, I've said that a little bit last time, but this is not like it's the opposite of somebody telling you, like, in other words, the Buddha's teaching something, but if you look at how the Buddha taught the four foundations of mindfulness, the Buddha famously said, right, don't just trust me, but check my teachings the way a goldsmith checks gold before paying for it, right? You don't hand a goldsmith something that looks gold, they pay for it, right? Like they check. And they say they cut it, they burn it, they do different processes. So here the Buddha is saying, check your own experience, right? That's the Buddha's teaching here. He's saying, be mindful of your own body, you know, and then he says, notice it's impermanent, right? So you check, and if you find something permanent, then you say, oh, the Buddha was wrong, if you could find something permanent in your body, then you would say, the Buddha was wrong. Body's not impermanent, right? And that the body is subject to suffering. Well, if you find your body's not subject to suffering, then you can say the Buddha was wrong. But so the Buddha said, check, and you see from your own experience, these are things I observe when I see bodies, when I observed when I check my own body. Now you check your body and see what you find, and then you come to know from your own experience um, those things. So one way of looking at the specific, we go through two different ways now of looking at the specific characteristics, but we'll go slowly because there's no hurry. Uh, so one way of looking at another way of looking at the body, so the specific characteristics. The first is they say the elements and the things that arise from those elements. And so it's just so this is one tool for being aware of the body. And so in this sense, and I find this a little, I also want to preface this next part. So when they say the elements and the elements and the things that arise from or evolve from the elements, um, I found this confusing until I studied it more. So, it's in many, actually in ancient um, India, but in many, actually, it's the same in many ancient cultures. They would talk about the elements being the earth, water, fire, and wind, right? It's common to many cultures. Um, but of course, growing up the way, America, I thought, well, what are they talking about? Those aren't the elements. I remember as a kid, I learned the elements on the periodic table. So I was like, it took me a while to kind of think, what are they talking about? Um, but here, actually, from a practice of mindfulness, it's actually quite useful because it's what it's getting at, actually, in this sense, is it's another way of being mindful of your body, right? So if you actually sit and be mindful of your body, what it's getting at is that when they talk about earth element, what they're actually getting at is there's solidity to your body, right? So you notice the solidity, the experience of solidity of your own body, right? Like, and so if you're sitting, actually, like just like right now, if you try it, right? Actually, like you can feel it wherever your butt is, say on a seat, right? You can feel the solidity of your body pushing down. It's like the weight, the, the bones are an example of the solidity of the body. They're more solid than other parts. So you notice that. You notice like if you feel like your hands resting on your lap or your legs or whatever, you can feel the solidity of that. So you notice that experience. So it's noting one kind of experience. So that there's the experience of like weight or solidity. And then you can feel your foot on wherever it's resting on. And then what this is getting at, this way of being aware of the body, is that but the body is not just solidity, right? It's also like so the fire element. What they're getting at there is warmth, right? That you notice your own experience of your body compared to the well, yeah, actually it is, right? 98.6 degrees. So it sustains a certain level of warmth. So you be aware, and we don't usually turn toward it. Unless you have a fever, you don't usually notice, right? But you notice like the temperature of your body. And you notice that as it compares to the external world. You can notice like parts of your body that are like inside of, or covered by clothing and not covered by clothing. So part of the experience of body is temperature. And the body is continually self-regulating its own temperature. So and you'll notice if you meditate over and over, right, sometimes your body will sweat, right, to cool itself off. Sometimes it'll shiver to warm itself up. Mm. Sometimes, like right, your body feel warm, like under your coat, but cold in your hands. So you notice the experience of warmth and temperature of your body. And when they say wind element, what they're getting, first of all, of course, it's the breath, right, which is different than the solidity of the body. But also that by wind element, they mean movement, right? So it's the breathing that moves the body, but it's also, it's the motility they're getting at. That the body isn't just something solid. That's why it's not like a rock, right? That can't move. So we breathe, but also we use the energy from the breath to move our bodies, right? So part of the nature of the body is motility, as long as we're alive. And so again, you may notice your own experience of these things, right? Solidity, warmth, breath, and motility, body. And then also we definitely have the experience of the water element, right? The most obvious example is like there's saliva in your mouth. Your eyes are moist. But also, there are many different liquids within the body, blood and blood and saliva and so on, urine, and lymph, and so on, all the other internal elements, pus. Mm. And even experientially, right? When we move, we can sense, right, the body, like the bones are less liquid, but like our belly moves. And if you jiggle your belly, it moves like you can feel there's liquidity. And so the body's made up of these kinds of experiences, And I've already started to mention, right? And those are connected to our organs. Those are the evolutes, right? That our organs are made up of these different, the bones are made of more, are, more solid, but they also have marrow, which is liquid, other element, the lungs involve movement of wind, but they also have their own amount of solidity and liquidity. So it's just it's a way of starting to be aware of different experiential aspects and organs of the body. And then the Buddha taught actually that you practice like this, you can be aware of, he listed like, you can be aware of uh, your head hair, your body hair, your nails, your teeth, your skin, muscles, tendons, bones, marrow, kidneys, the heart, the liver, connective tissue, spleen, lung, intestine, feces, the brain, sweat and fat, blood and pus, phlegm, tears, spit, snot, and so on. All different kinds of elements that make up the body. You can be more elaborate use a medical textbook if you like. But then, okay, so then if you're being aware, right, of the elements, like so those different aspects of our experience, and then the organs, and then again you can ask, right, different questions. One is anything permanent in those organs and elements? Or any of those elements or organs pure, like in the sense of totally free from the possibility of sickness or suffering? Well, the Buddha noted is if you check, you'll note that actually over time, right, we experience discomfort or sometimes pain in any part of the body. It's in the nature of the body that it's not completely free from suffering. Or any of those elements or organs the cell. Actually, if you really explore, right, even like say solidity, is that even intrinsically my body? Well, food comes in and goes out. Mm. Same with the breath, right? Same with the liquid. As we urinate, we spit, so on. And the heat, So are any of those a self, or any of those even intrinsically my body? Right? Or is there something that makes the body intrinsically separate from the external environment? Our skin seems to do that, but even the skin itself, right, it flakes off. And then we take in food and it regenerates. So is there a self in the elements of the body? Okay, so we come back together. So that's just one way of, so I'm just giving different ways of exploring. You see how these are different ways the Buddha taught to explore. That's one example of the specific aspect is those elements and those um, organs of the body.
Is space included in the body?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
so is it the space that the body occupies?
When they talk about the space in the body, what they're talking about is like, for example, like you could see, like if you go like I'll give an example. When you close your mouth, there's a certain amount of space inside your mouth.
Right.
Or in your nostrils, there's a certain amount of space.
Okay, okay.
And so that's in your body, it's space, right? And so you can say the same thing. Well, is there a self in that space? You know, in the space inside my nostrils. That's good. But and the same thing, right? There's space even in the internal cavities of our bodies. Like, like if when you see a surgeon, I mean, there's like space between the different organs. When you see somebody, if you see a video of somebody doing surgery, for example, right? There's like there's space between the organs. That's how they move, right? They shift. Or the heart can only expand and contract because there's space in the rib. The rib cage creates a space for it. So is there a self in that space? Is there a permanence in that space? Is there so yeah. But yeah, so that's how you explore space in relation to the body, is the internal space. Yeah. And go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, so if the I ceases to identify with the body, saying, well, this is precisely what we just, there is no I there, then is the I a conceptual product of the mind?
Actually, we'll get there. That's
Okay.
that comes, because we're just checking the body. Then you're going to check all the other.
Right.
There are four other things to check, right? So that's part of the process here. Is so first you say, is there an I, a self? Is it on the body? Is it in the body? Is it? But and what the mind will do, by the way, this is what for most, at least for me, but for most people, I think, is if you really meditate on this, right? And you can, it's not actually that hard to get to that. There's no self in the body. That's kind of obvious if you really explore it deeply. Um, and it's what actually all the Buddhist schools note is that then people say, must be in my mind. The mind is it.
Right.
And then we'll explore that in a minute,
Okay.
or in a few, or maybe not a minute, but at some point in this, that's why the mind comes third in this process, and then phenomena.
Right.
Is one keeps grasping at something.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And different Buddhist schools answer that question differently, but for sure they all agree that then the person would say that one says the mind, oh, the I must be in the mind. But we'll see if it is or not. That's the Buddhist question. The Buddha has a way of exploring that, but it's normal to ask that question. That's what we do because we want to. And part of that is that because we feel there must be an I. So if it's not in the body, it's got to be somewhere.
Right. Okay.
So that's what we do. But other questions actually before I go on. Just check. Okay. So the next one is feelings and the specific characteristic of feeling. That here they say this text says the entity of experience, but what it's getting at specifically, I've said this sometimes in the past, but in this context of, well, actually in the context of the five skandhas and the context of also Buddhist psychology, I always think it's not a better word in English, but feeling doesn't, in English sometimes when we say how are you feeling, we mean like what's your emotions, right? What are your or how's your day going or something. In this context, feeling has a very specific, it's referring to something very specific about our experience. So it's not the same feeling. It's not, the word is being used differently, put it that way. But I can't think of a better, I don't think I mean people use the word feeling because I don't think there is a better English term. And that's partly like Buddhist psychology gets it. The Buddhist psychology also gets into the emotions and talks about afflictive emotions and positive emotions. So it's a very extensive subject. So I guess my point is that we have to use English words in unique ways if you're going to speak English about this, because there aren't words naturally in English for these different specific phenomena. So you have to kind of know the definition as it's being used in the context, if that makes sense. So in this context, feeling, uh, which is the Buddha really emphasized, right? It's one of the five skandhas, right? The five heaps that make up a person. It's one of the omnipresent mental factors in Buddhist psychology that's always there. So it's emphasized a lot in Buddhism. So it's an important aspect of our experience. And I'll explain why from the Buddhist perspective. But so feeling in this context means, so I said it's an omnipresent mental factor. So what it's getting at is the Buddha asserts uh, that if you check your own experience, there's always, in any given moment, in relation to whatever you're experiencing, either a pleasant feeling tone, an unpleasant feeling tone, or a neutral feeling tone. Um, and that if you observe your own experience, that's just always there. It's always part of how you experience anything. Um, and So the first thing is, before I get into why, right, is so mindfulness of the specific characteristic of feeling, which is one of the four foundations of mindfulness, right, is that you actually, so you start in this context, you're not being mindful of the breathing or the body. You're noticing, and it's a new experience for people if you haven't tried it before, but if you can become quite adept at it if you try, if you put effort into it, if you explore it, in other words. But so it's actually that you start to notice, okay, in this instant and in relation to whatever I'm experiencing in this instant, what's my feeling tone? Is it pleasant? Is it unpleasant? Or is it neutral? And if you practice that, what you'll notice actually, like let's say, I'll give an example. Like say you're at home listening to a favorite song, right? And so you have a pleasant, you'll if you pause and notice, you'll think, oh, it's a pleasant feeling tone. I like this song, right? Is how you might say it. But what it's actually is a pleasant feeling, right? And then suddenly, if say somebody drives by your house with their windows down, blaring your least favorite song, then immediately there will be an unpleasant, right? You'll have an auditory consciousness, and it'll be associated with an unpleasant feeling. And then if they stay there, that unpleasant feeling will continue. If they turn off their car or they drive away, and then you turn your attention back to the song you were listening to, then there'll be a pleasant feeling, right? And say while you're doing that, you're cooking dinner. We're just giving an example, right? Then suddenly, one moment you may smell a spice in your food that you're cooking. Now it's an olfactory moment of awareness, right? And you may say, "Oh, I like that spice," right? So there's a pleasant feeling tone there, And then like if somebody, you see their phone ring and it's somebody you don't want to talk to, right? Then you see that, oh, that's so and so. Then you have an unpleasant moment, right? And so there's a constant. My point, I'm just giving an example here. Actually, if you start to check your experience of feelings, it's a constant it's in relation to each object of our perception, right? In any given moment, there's some feeling tone. Sometimes it's neutral, right? A lot of times it's neutral. If you're just sort of walking down the street, say you're not noticing anything, then you may just have a kind of neutral, like you're ignoring it. There are houses there, you're vaguely aware of them, but you're not thinking, oh, that's a beautiful house, or oh, that house is annoying me, or oh, that. So then it's a kind of neutral feeling tone. But then say, your ankle starts to hurt. Well, then there'll be an unpleasant feeling tone, right? And so on. Um, so the first practice here of the mindfulness, or the close placement of mindfulness, I guess they're calling here, of a feeling, is that you would just start to notice, okay, is that true actually? In other words, what's that like for me? And so you start to notice in this moment, how am I feeling? What's my feeling tone in this moment, in this moment? And if you do that, you'll start to notice, um, that you relate to different kinds of objects with different kinds of feelings, obviously, right? Um, and we all have experiences, right, of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. That's for sure true, isn't it? And another thing I want to point out is what you'll notice also is you can't turn that off. Like you said, it's
Mhm.
omnipresent. Like so, you could you could wish you can get yourself to a neutral if you really try sometime, like but that's still a neutral feeling tone. Does that make sense? So it's still not, and then still something will come along that you find pleasant or unpleasant eventually. Um, and that's inescapable, right? So like there's no place you can go to get a vacation from feeling. pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And I've often given examples of that, right? If you go to the beach, right, there's going to be, you may think, oh, the beach is so pretty, that's pleasant. Then you may start to feel too hot, that's unpleasant, right? Um, and so on, yeah. Anyway, it's a continuous process of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And so you first start by doing that. You actually sit, and we're used to sitting and watching the breath or something. But here you sit and you say, okay, let me be aware of my feelings. What's my feeling tone this moment? And then you'll start, and you may think, well, how's that going to be very interesting if I'm just sitting? But actually becomes interesting pretty quickly because, right, if you actually sit and start to notice your experience, you experience a little bit of pain in your body, it's unpleasant. Then you think, oh, that's unpleasant, which is also that thought is it unpleasant. So then now you're not any longer. What you'll actually start to notice if you really practice the close placement of mindfulness and feeling is the first instant you're aware of a physical sensation of pain. Let's say, give me an example, and there's an unpleasant feeling tone. Then you have a mental phenomena, right, which is, oh, that's so annoying. Why? Or I'm worried. Why is my whatever? Why does my knee hurt? Is something wrong with my knee? Is there a meniscus problem? Whatever you can elaborate, right? All of that is actually a mental consciousness, right? That's related to thoughts with an unpleasant feeling tone, right? And then if you start to go, oh, no, then you may like forget about that and focus on, say, your breath, and then you have some pleasant. There comes a pleasant experience if you just kind of have freedom from thoughts, right? Where you're kind of focused on the breath. But then that's pleasant feeling tone, right? Pleasant feeling tone. Oh, I'm just being aware of the breath. That's kind of peaceful, right? Pleasant feeling tone, and so on. So that's just that's the process of becoming aware of these feeling aggregate, right? And remember, it's one of the five aggregates, right? So it's like if you don't practice being aware of it, well, then you don't know that much about it. But it's your own experience. It's part of your own experience. It's one thing that Buddha's pointing out. Now, why did the Buddha emphasize feeling so much? There are many other mental factors. Why did the Buddha sort of emphasize this one? And what the Buddha and it comes more later, but I think it's a good place to explain it, to talk about it, is that our main the Buddha said our main mental afflictions are ignorance, uh, craving, and aversion. Right? Yeah. And so what the Buddha noted, and that you have to check from your own experience, is this is ordinarily whenever we have a pleasant feeling tone, we crave for more of that. And we crave for the object that we associate that feeling tone with. And whenever we have an unpleasant feeling tone, we develop aversion to that. And and then all the other mental afflictions, apart from ignorance, elaborate out from there, right? Like so, and my example earlier, right? Like so, when I'll give the example of like you're listening to a song and then somebody drove up with, right? So when you're listening to the song you like, you start grasping, right? Like, um, and often as oh, I like, I don't know, is that, and they're all different versions of grasping, but we start having attachment to something, right? To a pleasant sound. And then when the other person comes along and they're blaring whatever's your least favorite thing, right? Then first it's aversion, right? It's a pleasant feeling tone that leads to aversion. And then ordinarily what people do, right, is they do that how we develop anger, right? Or, you think, oh, that person's so whatever. And you start to elaborate and you become angry at the person who's playing the loud music. Um, and so on, it elaborates from there, right? The same thing with the smell or the food, right? So then you develop a kind of attachment to that, right? And then if somebody were to take your portion of that from the fridge or something, you might get angry at them and so on. It goes on. And my point is that what the Buddha observed here was that pleasant feeling tone that Buddha said we live in the realm, he called our realm of experience the desire realm, right? And what he was getting at was that if you check your own experience, most of the time you're craving for something, you're desiring something, you're wanting something. And then uh, anger actually is less frequent, but is usually because your desire is thwarted, right, by something or is impinged upon. Um, and so I want to actually pause here because I actually think this is what the Buddha said, but if you're, I think, if you don't check your own experience, you might say, well, I'm not like, yeah, you might say to yourself, I don't know, but you might say to yourself, well, sure, every now and then, like I want to, I remember once I wanted to get a raise or I wanted to find a partner or I wanted to whatever, something or other, right? But most of the time, I'm wanting something. You might think that. And so the Buddha said, well, check your own experience, right? And and I'll say this like this help. I'm going to share something because it helped my own practice quite a lot. Um, it was actually Lama Zopa Rinpoche, late teacher, died 2 years ago, just this month. But 2 years ago this month. But he used to always he sometimes would say the person he would say the peace of mind, the incredible peace. If you know how to actually experience letting go of desire and just having, he said, like if you're just like chilling out with no desire, laying around is what he put it. He said, if you're just laying around with no desire, he said, nobody else in the world knows that peace. People don't know how peaceful that, like people don't know that kind of peace because they're always wanting. And and so you check actually. And you know, like are you, and if you check your experience moment to moment, like are you wishing things were different than they are in some way? Right. For example, these days it might be, are you wishing things in the world were different? How much of your day do you spend wishing that? Are you wishing things in your country or the world are different? Are you wishing things in your neighborhood were different? Are you wishing things in your that the people you live with were slightly different, right? That they would stop doing this and start doing that? Are you wishing that they, that and like, are you wishing that it was time for lunch or time for dinner? Are you wishing it was time to go do the next thing? And then when you're doing the next thing, are you wishing it was time for something else? And even as you're doing the thing you want, are you wishing that something else would not be happening? Does that make sense? And and if you start to notice moment by moment that, it becomes very disturbing actually in a good way. Like um because the Buddha is saying notice your actual experience, right? So if you start to notice this thing of like feeling, right? What you'll notice, I think, if you check, that's what the Buddha is asserting, right? Is that you'll notice, first of all, there's constantly some feeling tone. And then mostly everything you do is because you want something, right? Like, why do you go to sleep? Why do you get up? Why do you go in the next room? Right. And what the Buddha is asserting, right, is that that's not the cause of peace. Right? In your own experience, you'll find that doesn't lead to, right. If you're always, because you can't turn off your feeling, right? They're always constantly there. They're omnipresent. As I said, an omnipresent mental factor. And if you're always controlled by, like, it's actually, if you really explore this, right, what you start to find is that, okay, so feelings are omnipresent. They're always there. I have no control actually over what arises in my sensory experience, right? Like I can't even control if my body will suddenly have a pain, right? Much less the external stuff. Like I can't control whether some external event happens, like whether it be in my neighborhood or in the world. I can't control my own body, whether it feels like my elbow could feel pleasant or unpleasant. I have no control over that at all, right? I could suddenly have a problem. And so if I'm always wanting things to be a certain way, but I have no control over whether they'll be that way, um, that's suffering, isn't it? That's a kind of suffering. And it's not the kind of suffering I want to point out. Like, this is where I think we don't explore it enough, this question. Because we think of suffering, which is correct. It is one kind of suffering, the suffering of suffering. We recognize if I have a headache, that's suffering. Or if somebody like whacks me in the head with a stick, that's suffering. We know that. But what the Buddha is getting at is this is a subtler level of suffering, right? Um, is I'm always controlled actually by things I don't have control over. And I'm always craving for something that I can't make happen. And even if I do make it happen, then I'm craving for something else. Um, and there's no end to that. it doesn't end actually, right? They say that even as you die, you're craving to not die, like and so on. So it doesn't stop, you know. And even in your dreams, you're doing it, right? Like you're wishing, you're even in your dreams, you're wishing for something, wishing for not something. And do you get that? I'm just hoping so like this meditation on feeling actually is very profound. Does that make sense? I know people are starting to get a sense of it, right? Where you meditate on this and you start to notice that and you go, oh, so I'm always like we just actually it's funny. I went because I'm just thinking it's very it's typical. There's nothing unusual about this, but we flew all the way to a foreign country and we were walking on the beach, right? But my sandals were hurting my foot. So I was like, oh, I wish that wasn't. Then I'm like noticing, like, oh wow, my foot hurts. Starting to get like a little sore or something. How far can I walk, right? It's like, and then and then it goes on from there, and it's kind of a little too hot, and so on. But the water's nice. Oh, okay, good. And then like that, but then, well, do I want to go in the water? Well, now the water, whatever, and on from there. You can't get away from it, is my point. There's no place on the planet or on any other planet you can go to escape your own relationship to your feelings. And I just want to say one more point here because I just think it's important. It's not, I mean, it's actually implicit in this teaching. It's not said explicitly, but actually, like in the Lamrim, right, the stages of the path to enlightenment teachings, uh, the very first point, right, is I mean, well, not the first point in the Lamrim, not but the first practice, like if you're going to practice Dharma, I guess there are three scopes. That's what I'm getting at, right? The low scope, the middle scope, and the great scope. Great scope is Mahayana, Bodhicitta, right? So we want to be, if we're Tibetan Buddhist practitioners are generally Mahayana, we say that, right? Like, so you're trying to practice with bodhicitta, the compassionate wish to achieve enlightenment for all sentient beings. But it's like the other day I was reading a teaching where Lamas, somebody said to Lama Zopa like, what's the best way to practice to develop bodhicitta? And usually you say, the 7-point cause and effect method or equalizing self for others. Those are the methods to generate bodhicitta. But he said to this person, focus on your own suffering. Uh, and part of the point is I'm getting at is this is if everything we're doing is controlled by wanting something and not wanting something in real daily life, then you can't have bodhicitta in that moment, right? Any moment where whereas if I'm doing something because I want to be more comfortable, then I'm not practicing bodhicitta in that moment. And if 99% of my moments are that, then mostly I'm not practicing bodhicitta at all, right? Maybe for like a few minutes when I think, okay, I'm going to try and develop bodhicitta right now. But bodhicitta won't pervade your life, right? Compassion won't pervade your life because what pervades your life is sort of craving for feelings and for the objects of feelings and to get away from the objects of negative feeling. So this practice, in a way, also it's the practice. If you practice it well, and I find I found this very hard to understand. But they talk about like something there, this phrase in Buddhism where they talk about giving up on this life or giving up on the fantasies of this life or abandoning this life or abandoning the fantasies or abandoning. I always thought, like what does that actually mean? Like, because you have to eat, right? You're gonna die if you don't eat, and you have to sleep. So what does it mean to give up on the fantasies of this life? And what they mean by that, I think, at least best I can tell, is noticing your own relationship to feelings and the fantasies of this life are fantasizing that you can control the objects of your experience. And I think, and actually I think I'm part of, and many of you are, I think I'm part of, like all human beings are, that's a problem, right? We have the fantasy that we can control our experience and sort of manage the world to make it the way I want it to be so that I can be comfortable. And I would say I think I'm part of a culture that's like the most extreme expression of that that's ever existed, right? Where you literally like pave things, we're trying to pave the planet and like, you know, we, we air condition and heat everything. We do everything we can to try to control the external environment to make it comfortable. And what the Buddha is saying is, um, Buddha's observation is that'll never work. Tom.
Question.
Yeah.
If, is this a correct thinking, and not that we can escape this inescapable feeling of unpleasant and pleasant, but when that arises, I mean, is karma related to this at all?
Yeah.
In the way that we can't control, but in some ways we very much can control. So even as you are experiencing your sandal thing, I mean, that whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, we made choices long ago that put us in those circumstances. So I find a lot of freedom in when I experience these things, taking responsibility. And I mean, that gets complicated because, like, in thinking about poverty or illness or child abuse, talking about karma and thinking about, that can be very complicated, but just on a daily level, if I'm told I didn't bring a sweater, if I'm experiencing things in this relationship, I chose this partner. So I was just asking, am I on the right line of thinking that there's some peace in when you experience it, just experience it, and also understand the part that you play and bring yourself to that place.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And I'll say a few just elaborations on what you said. But first of all, yes, I think you're on the right track. And a few things. One is because one point is like, I said we can't control what's going to arise in our experience. Uh, Buddhist teachings would say actually part of that, I mean, in the present moment, I can control that because and they would say mainly how I experience that phenomenon is a result of my own past karma, right? And there are many ways to think about that, right? But like even my example where I said like if the person is playing the least favorite song, right? Well, that's my least favorite song. They like it, and if I liked it, I would find it wonderful. And the same thing, you think like, oh, the food thing, right? Like I gave the smell of the right. Well, one person loves this, another person will have an allergic reaction to it, and so on. Um, so it's like, so I guess one point I'm making though is just more generally is whatever we experience, there's some sensory experience, but how we experience that is a result of our own karma, also our own biology, also our own history, and so on. So that's one point is so, and so we can control that in the present. We can't control what will arise in the present. We can't control the feeling, but it is a result of karma, is one point. But then the other point is that I think, and I want to just elaborate on what you said, although not the same kind of point, is um, if one understands this whole set of teachings well, then it opens the door to actually practicing Dharma in a different way. Because what happens then is that the person who practices mindfulness of feeling deeply, right, will still have unpleasant experiences. There's no escaping that, right? Unless you're enlightened. If you're an arhat, then maybe you don't have that, but otherwise you're going to have unpleasant experiences. But for that person, right, uh, instead of reacting to those with like, so you have an unpleasant experience, right? But if you understand, I'm going to give an example, right? A very simple example. Like, if you understand how karma works, right? And let's say you make your practice loving kindness, for example, right? Then you would say, well, if anything I do out of love will make me happy in the present moment, because love is joyful, and will create good karma for the future. So whatever arises, my practice is love. Right? So like I could have, somebody plays music I don't like, my practice is love. Something. So I'm just giving one. There are many Dharma practices you do. I'm just giving one simple example, right? Uh, you know, the person in my house does something I don't like, my practice is love. People in the world do something that I think is foolish, my practice is love. Um, and then whatever action comes from that love, right? Then you may decide, well, I want to do that, But if you're cultivating love inside yourself, then whatever, karma means action, right? Then whatever activity you do is coming from love, right? That's different than if it's coming from anger or resentment or whatever, all the other mental afflictions. And there are other positive emotions. I'm just giving one example because it's a simple one, love and kindness. Um, but you get the point there. So like then you can actually practice Dharma. You're free to, you're free to practice Dharma because you're free to, you still have pleasant experiences and unpleasant experiences. But now, just one more point, like, I remember many teachers use it, but Khenchen Rinpoche taught, there was a scholar from Kashmir, actually, Kashmiri Pandita. They call it, Pandita means scholar, right? Like Nehru Pandit, like it's a Sanskrit word, it means scholar. But there was, and he said something like, when I suffer, may it dry up the suffering of all beings. When I'm happy, may I share it with all beings. And actually, I'll share. I'm going off on a tangent here for a moment, but I remember that when I went to see many years ago, two. I went to see my grandmother as she was dying, and she was dying of incredible pain, liver cancer. So she was like extreme, extreme physical pain. So it was just like, when people are in that pain, where it's like, well, you have to take enough of opiates to not, but then you can't pay attention. So she wanted to spend time with me. So she was like, she was saying to my grandfather, I'm taking less opiates because I want to interact. So I was like, wow, she's embracing pain because she valued interacting more than that. And she was very close to death. And she said the same thing Kashmiri Pandit said. She said, what she said, may this um, free others from such pain. And wherever I go after I die, may I help others. That's all I want. Wherever I'm needed most, may I go there. It's the same prayer as Kashmir. So it's like you don't have to be some spiritual Buddhist. I only tell a story, so you don't have to be from somebody from Kashmir to say that. She wasn't Buddhist or anything, but her practice was love. Actually, that was her practice in life. So she died with love. And so my point is it's not this right. She was in as much pain as she could be in. And my point is, so the feeling tone was definitely not positive, but the practice can be, and that's Dharma practice, right? Like, so if you're practicing Dharma, but if you don't do this, then you can't, then you're trapped, right? You just are reacting by going, oh, I wish I wasn't in pain. Why am I in pain? How can I get out of this pain? Whereas if you're practicing Dharma, you still experience whatever you experience, but then you're free to relate to it through whichever way, and then that way you're creating the karma that's a better karma that then will lead to a better experience in the future anyway. So then that takes care of itself in that sense. Anyway, I went on and on about this, but do you see? I mean, I think this practice of the one in relation to feeling, if we don't do that, actually, this is one of the four foundations of mindfulness. But if we don't do this practice for ourselves, I think actually it's not possible to practice Dharma really. We like for myself, when I'm not practicing that one, then I go through the motions of practicing Dharma because I'm Buddhist. I like practicing doing things, but I'm actually not really practicing Dharma. But if you're doing this, then you can practice Dharma because you're not following craving or aversion. Does that make sense? And if you're following craving and aversion for feeling tones, well, then there's no space in your mind. I mean, you could be doing the physical, like there's that famous story where Dromdompa, who was Atisha's main disciple, great. He was a layperson, Tibetan layperson, right? And this famous story. Where he had a disciple, and the disciple said, "I want to practice Dharma," and so you probably heard it, right? Where then he was like, doing prostrations, and Dromdompa came and said, "That's not actually doing prostrations, but it'd be better if you practice Dharma." And then the guy said, "Oh wow, what like." I think forgetting he was practicing maybe generosity, giving away things, and Dromdompa said, "Oh, that's nice. You're practicing giving away things, but you better practice Dharma." And then the guy was sitting and meditating, and Dromdompa came in and said, "That's nice that you're sitting and meditating. It'd be better if you practice Dharma." And the guy got frustrated and said, "Like, well, what does it mean to practice Dharma?" And he said, "Give up on the fantasies of this life in your mind." Right. So the guy was doing what I often do, which is like going through the motions of practicing Dharma. But he wasn't practicing the four foundations of mindfulness, so he was still following some kind of craving, right? He was thinking like, some on some subtle level, he was thinking, "Oh, I'll do prostrations because then that'll be good, right? It'll be a good thing." But what did he mean by a good thing? Does that make sense? He wasn't actually. He was still craving for something. He had some fantasy that would lead to something, some kind of comfort, some kind of. It wasn't out of love. It wasn't out of compassion. It wasn't out of renunciation, right? So it wasn't Dharma practice. So anyway, you get my point. Is like this one is actually, I don't know, I think it's like necessary if we want to actually practice. Otherwise, we go through the motions of practice. So these practices can seem, they're very profound, I guess, in that sense. They're not as like, they're not like as esoteric as some of the other practices, but they're the foundation actually. of everything for Buddhist practitioners. Anyway, any questions about? So that's a practice of the specific characteristic of feeling. Or comments?
Mindfulness, yeah, meditation on feeling, kind of comparing it a little bit in my mind to the aggregates. It sounds like the meditation feeling here is a little broader than just the aggregate feeling. In other words, you said it's also the craving. So it's feeling and a craving for the feeling. It seems to be getting a little bit into the what mental compositions.
You're right, yeah.
Any comment?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, so the actual, I guess, good point. What he was saying was that like it's more than just, that it can. Frank was pointing out it could be more than the way I was explaining it. It could be more. That seems like more than just the aggregate of feeling because you're starting to notice the mental afflictions, or the yeah, and so on, like the and other mental factors, which is true. And I guess what I'll say is like so. There's if a person, you're making a good point. So if a person were only practicing close placement of mindfulness just on feelings, then they would, and it is a good practice. It's actually the foundation. So first you would start to just notice moment by moment, what's the feeling, what's the feeling, what's the feeling. Um, in order to start, and really, I mean, we start with that because that's the way to become aware of the feelings. And we're usually, at least I notice that when I start to practice this, that usually I'm not aware of the moment to moment feelings. Like I make up a story, like, and I'm like, wow, it's weird how you do that. Like you can make up a story where you go, oh wow, this was so great, and then but then if you actually, so I'm getting back to, if you actually go to just the simple practice of mindfulness of feeling, you start to notice what's the feeling, what's the feeling, what's the feeling. But then you're right, then you start to and in the teachings on this four foundations of mindfulness, what it says is that the Buddha emphasized that aggregate and being aware of that aggregate because it then allows us to have the wisdom to understand. So then you do elaborate to these other, oh wow, look how that gives rise to craving, look how that gives rise to aversion, look how that gives rise to all the other various mental afflictions, which are actually part of the mindfulness phenomena, as you're hinting, but or implying, correctly implying, but so yeah, so the first practice is just the feelings themselves, but then pretty quickly you start to notice, and they're saying that is the reason why you be mindful of feelings. That and and I'll make one more point. They actually point this out when it's actually in the next section, but it's related to your question. So they say another specific characteristic of the body, which we just covered, is suffering, the truth of suffering, because the body is the truth of suffering, actually. But then of the Four Noble Truths, mindfulness, the foundation or the close placement of mindfulness on feelings is a meditation on the cause of suffering, the second noble truth. So that's where you do have to, that you do inevitably elaborate out to when you're doing the specific characteristic of how feeling is a meditation on the cause of suffering. You have to then look at how does feeling relate to craving and grasping and desire. So it does elaborate to more than feeling. Then you're right. Yeah. Oh, and then John has his hand up.
Yeah, I couldn't hear the question from the people who are directly there, but I think we're all on the same page about the way our thoughts are going based on what I was, hearing your response. But when we were talking about this a few weeks ago too, maybe a distinction between sensation and feeling, and I was trying to get a better handle on, what's being translated. And one way that my thought process was going was that when Buddha talked about the five skandhas, he talked about, the second one, of course, being feeling or sensation, and then the third one being, what's variously translated as discrimination or perception. And then the fourth skandha, then all the other mental factors. So, what you were referring to earlier too, just, why pluck out that particular mental factor of just feeling or sensation. And then furthermore, that third skandha, and the mental factor of discrimination and perception. So my sense is that much of the purpose of practicing mindfulness, as we're discussing now on feelings, and then if we talked about that third skandha of discrimination or and perception is to really isolate them and think about it. Because in our ordinary experience, for example, if I stub my toe and initially there's just that nerve sensation that's very unpleasant. And then the conceptual elaboration is that, I probably say a curse word and think about, boy, I really wish that hadn't happened. But it's really bundling together without thinking about it. It's bundling together that sensation with the perception or the discrimination. So I think again, and then I think maybe as two of the previous people were pointing out, that the karma that we collected actually forces that whole process. So, but anyway, this is helping me a lot because I think that I'm really starting to see the value as I had not so much before of really isolating, these different experiences and different ways that we conceptually label them.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you said. And I think I said this last time, but if not, I was double checking here. It says, the feeling, and I don't, the Sanskrit is Vedana. Yeah, so it's the Vedana. That's and it's also the same word. It says here it's the same word in Sanskrit and Pali. So that's the Sanskrit term for the feeling
Yeah. Mm.
aggregate. But yeah, no, I think what you said makes perfect sense. I agree.
Do you think it's the case that the further away you get from emotions or attachment to emotions and feelings, that the opposite becomes harder to understand? Um,
Well, I should say, explain a little more what you mean.
okay. I had this experience, okay, recently with a friend, and it's been, we've had all these cases that are really important come to us, and we're in a good position relative to our experience to deal with it. So I was telling a friend about it, and she said, well, so you feel you haven't lost your edge. And I'm thinking, edge? What is she saying? It's almost like the further away you get from, wanting recognition or pride or, all these things, the other world becomes sort of less understanding.
Oh, I get it. Could people hear her question? She was saying as you get further from certain kinds of, like, I would call them worldly, if you are practicing these kind of teachings and then you are getting further and further from the experience of kind of worldly grasping at certain worldly motivations, like for fame or for recognition or for, then does it become harder to relate to those kinds of emotional experiences that are craving for those? And I think you're right. I think it does. Actually, I'll share, it makes me remember funny story. A time somebody, actually it was my Reaper Rinpoche was pictured there, and was a wonderful yogi and practitioner, a Dharma practitioner. But he what somebody was raising that question to him. Actually, a very very similar question. They were saying, well, people, like it's, they were feeling so different from, like, because they were actually trying to practice, and they were saying, well, I feel like very different from, my motivation is different from people. I can't relate to, kind of what you're saying. I can't relate. They can't relate to me. And then he was very funny. He said, actually, it's more than that. He said, if you're practicing, if you're really practicing Dharma in this way, right? Then he said, then actually, um, if people really knew your motivation, they would think you're crazy. And they would say, but if you look at their motivation, you'll think they're crazy. He says, well, then it's okay. Everybody's like, he kind of said, so that's okay. So like, if they really knew how you're feeling, what you really are doing, they would think you're crazy. If you really know what they're doing, then of course that would seem, because in your example, right, like from a Dharma practitioner perspective, you would say, well, like doing an entire career just to try to become well known or have, what an insane thing to do. What a waste of a life, right? Then you die and who cares? And everybody forgets you anyway. And what a waste. That's a totally wasted life. That'd be a crazy thing to do. But then to somebody else, if they said, well, like, you know, how, like, who doesn't want to be famous? Who doesn't want to have notoriety? Who doesn't want recognition? Of course you should want recognition. That's crazy. Like, recognition is basic to human, you know, what human beings should want. So like, it's the exact opposite in a sense. Like, you know, what the Dharma person wants and what the other person are the exact opposite. So that's what he was getting at there. So I think you're exactly right. And you know, obviously you can still understand it if you think about it, but it should become further and further from your, or it's good sign if it becomes further and further from one's own experience, because that's what he was getting at, is like, well, wanting those things is crazy because it actually makes you suffer. You know, it's like what Shanti Davis said. It's like, it's as if you're craving for the very thing that causes you suffering, right? Because like, which the other person doesn't realize. They think it would make them happy because they don't realize it makes suffering. So it's the exact opposite perspective. So yeah, I think you're exactly right. Ah, that's funny.
Because I get it.
Yeah. But and it really is true, isn't it? Though, like, I guess that's what we're getting. I mean, this, if you're practicing these teachings, and it's weird. Like, I just want to emphasize that because I think, like, I guess I'm sharing because I've struggled with it many times over the years. Is like, you know, because people ask those questions, right? Like, well, what would it mean? Like, so if you give up on the fantasies of this life, then you become happy, right? And it's getting at, you're free from caring about the things that don't matter, right? Like, so you have so much peace. Uh, but if you're still attached to those things, you know, that if, in other words, it's all like, I'm saying, I'm giving a Rebrimshake point with somebody else, but if there's still a part of, I guess, once there's still been a part of me grasping at those things, then I'm in conflict with myself and I can't get, and I don't have that peace. But if you can actually practice this kind of teaching, then you actually get that peace, and then of course it doesn't matter anymore, those things. Right? Like, very interesting. I just find that, you know, I find it very interesting because it's like, it's the foundation, you know, nothing else works. If you don't have this teaching, then all the rest of Buddhism doesn't work, you know, and it's like, that's what Drum Trungpa was getting at that story, but it's like, you could go off and do a long retreat and it doesn't actually do anything, you know, but if you have this, then it does something. You know, if this is the teaching that makes it, it's the doorway or something, you know, to practicing Dharma, actually. But yeah, so I think you're right that it's more and more distant then from, and it's like, it seems weird. So that's a good sign that, yeah.
I hope so. That's attention.
But I guess we should stop. But I think we have class. Anyway, it's already scheduled for. I think it's next week, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have class. I think it's next week. And then I meant to send it out. I'll send this week. I'll send, or the next couple of days. I'll send out the schedule for May and June both.
Okay.
So those are what I'll see. But and okay, so do a dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so that the I, who is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And then, you know, through practicing this kind of teaching and the four foundations of four close placements or foundations of mindfulness, you know, may all of us actually be able to, um, you know, succeed in progressing. You know, they're part of the harmonies with enlightenment, so we be able to practice them in order to ourselves actually be in harmony with enlightenment. You know, and be able to practice in this way, in the way that the Buddha taught, in order to progress on the path and achieve, you know, our own liberation from suffering, and then full enlightenment of Buddhahood to help all beings be free from suffering and its cause. And thanks very much.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Lauren.
Thank you,
Thank
Lauren.
you. Yeah, good to see everybody.
Bye.
Stop.